This is part 2 of week 8's lecture, and we're going to talk about worldviews and scenarios in this second part. And first I want to identify a set of worldviews that were used by the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And in this assessment of ecosystem services and impact on ecology across the globe, they came out with 4 scenarios that they could use to describe general choices we might have to move into the future. One of those was global orchestration. This is a hierarchist type view, a committed environmentalist type view, and the idea was if everybody works together and sets policies, we could move that would determine how our environmental future turned out. The other was called order from strength, and there you can see this wall, and there's wealth inside and poor people outside, and this is, if you have it, protect it, and if you don't have it, you're going to have to come up against this wall. A third one was the techno garden, and that techno garden is essentially an individualist point of view where we're going to rely on technology to solve lots of problems. And here you have a picture of somebody running a console to use wind energy to grow greenhouses full of food. And the fourth was this adapting mosaic, which is you have all sorts of people working together. This is essentially an egalitarian point of view. Small areas, but everybody works together as a community, and by working together they have a better outcome. So to elaborate on these scenarios, these were the key features that they found in these scenarios. And again, global orchestration or policy reform, a hierarchist point of view. It focused on policy and economics and governments and growing the economies and the sort of coordinated management of all these resources. The order from strength, which is a fortress or fatalist point of view, recognized the future might have regional, fragmented world, and that there's going to be security issues, and that nations have to protect their own interests, and they shouldn't really rely on treaties because those are weak. And in this system, they realized that the ecosystem services were very vulnerable to damage. And again, the point of this was to do these assessments so that we could talk about the future. So by creating these scenarios, they were able to talk about possible paths we might launch onto. The adapting mosaic, this is the new sustainability. We have regional and watershed scale projects going on, local ecosystem management, like relying on ecosystem services to provide resilience and robustness under maybe disturbances, and a great diversity in approaches, a really aggressive pluralistic approach. And this adapting mosaic, this new sustainability approach, this is really what Portland looks like now, with all sorts of watershed councils and lots of farms and local farms and urban gardening, all this sort of stuff going on. This is really what's happening in one location, but can it be spread globally? That's a big question. And then the final one was sort of a techno garden using market approaches, where you have technology and highly controlled ecosystems really reaching some sort of high productivity and efficiency, and use ecological engineering approaches and environmental entrepreneurship. Next week we're going to talk about some examples of environmental entrepreneurship, which is correcting environmental problems using market forces. And given that some of those were caused by market forces, it seems reasonable that we could rely on the power of business and the ubiquity of those sorts of forces to help us solve those problems. Okay, another approach is that I've used on Upper Klamath Lake was to get this set of worldviews. Now, these are the worldviews, just like we described before, the individualist, hierarchist, egalitarian, deep ecology, and fatalist. And where I found these set of worldviews was from a discussion about, or where I uncovered these, was a discussion about specific ways to clean up Klamath Lake, to restore Klamath Lake. And in that discussion, which was supposedly a technical discussion, I mean mainly technical, there were people that represented these different points of views. They didn't come out and say, I'm an individualist and I think free market would solve it, but in the undertone and and the sort of key phrases they were using, these value-laden worldviews came out. And so what I did is turn these different worldviews into scenarios, and I did that by enlisting the help of an artist who created a drawing of what the lake might look like given these sorts of worldviews. So for example, under individualistic worldview, where the economy is really the key aspect, you're going to see big shiny buildings that have a large represent an economic revival of that area. You're going to see the water being used for both pollution, transport, and irrigation. You're going to have industrial-sized farms and feedlots. There's still going to be this wetland because the wetland has an economic value and utility to the people, but it's just not going to be very widespread. So you can imagine a lakefront down in, this was for Klamath Falls, but it could be translated to other places, would have these features. And what I'm going to come back to later, these are very recognizable features. They're just in a particular distribution, a lot of economic activity and maybe less natural capital. The hierarchist view of that future would be where you'd use rules and incentives, laws and incentives, and policy, crafted policy, to really have the cleanest water possible. And here you have people swimming in the water, and you have a sewage treatment plant to treat water that might come off some of these farms. You can see that there's a nice buffer between the farms and the lake going through this wetland. This represents some rules like we have now about isolating sources of pollutants from lake interference. Smaller feedlots maybe to keep the pollution down. And again, a smaller economic growth, but very targeted to take advantage of some of the nice amenities of clean water. Also in this picture you see, here's people swimming in the very clean water, and there's little signs here. Maybe they say, where to swim or where not to swim, or what you can do, what you can't do. But again, the idea of a hierarchist is that they would be expert at managing this lake water so it's clean, but then also everybody would obey those rules. Okay, another worldview-based scenario would be this egalitarian, where you have a community and they're all growing vegetables. And maybe some livestock. There's different types of livestock represented here. There's a much more predominant role that the ecosystem plays in the marsh area. People are fishing, people are hiking in it. There's a whole range of technologies, from solar panels to wind power to different types of vehicles and bicycles. People are all bringing this together in a community to make it work, and they're cooperating. That's the key part. So it's a mosaic of different approaches all in the same community. And then another worldview is deep ecology, sort of back to nature. Let the marsh take over, let trees grow up next to the marsh, have a natural community down there like it used to be, have the farms be isolated and back away from the lake, and have the lowest footprint as possible. Possibly a lower technology solution, just because it would minimize the footprint and minimize the impact of humans on the landscape, and definitely fewer people. That's part of a deep ecology, is to maintain a lower population to have minimum impact. And the final point was a fatalistic approach of, well, we've got this system and we just need to protect ourselves from nature and from each other. So there's a lot of protection going on in a fatalistic approach. For example, the lake is uncertain and maybe considered to be dangerous for erosion, so you build a real armored lake front. There's very little marsh because that's really sort of uncontrollable. You have a feedlot, but you would put razor wire around it instead of just some sort of minimal fencing. You have big industry and big pipes, all of these sorts of things. The homes are surrounded by, everybody has their own little fence, and if you did well in the individual economy, you get a big house, and if you didn't do so well, you have a smaller house. So that's just part of individualism being played out. But for fatalists, instead of moving forward, it's like, okay, this is what we got to protect what we have. Now, one of the things that often fatalists get a bad rap because they seem too much like just, I've got mine, I'm going to keep it. But another another twist on this fatalism is that often these attempts to have huge new environmental projects with everything shiny and new and futuristic really is that they don't believe you're going to be able to pull it off. You know, they look out at the road and they see potholes. They look over at pipes and they see leaky pipes that are collapsing under, you know, from misuse and old age. And they say, well, if you can't even keep the current stuff running, why should we believe that you're going to be able to have this bright, shiny, new, futuristic scenario for the future? So that's another sort of way of looking at fatalism, is that they're really technology skeptics. Okay, now the point of discussing these scenarios, if we discuss this in a community, which one of these outcomes would you like to have? Individual, you know, economic renaissance, expert lake management, a mosaic and community, a back to nature sort of approach, or this you're all crazy, I just need to, you know, protect my own family and my own little neighborhood sort of approach. So you can think about that very concretely. I think this is important when we have environmental science, when we say what are the views of the future. I think it's going to take, you have to build trust to get people to even discuss the future, and that's going to take deliberate effort. So you have to describe the outcomes in a very concrete way, and you need to involve the whole community. So there's several views of the future, and I just want to end on this. One is that the future essentially repeats the past. This is a historical or continuity type approach, and that the main points can be addressed just by addressing what we already know from history, or some cultures believe that events are cyclic. What went around before, we're going to see that come back. And so if we study the history and the context of that, we'd be able to address the future. Another view is modernity, where the future is different than the past. And a good example of this is when Christopher Columbus set off and discovered the Caribbean islands, and sort of indication that there was a whole continent out there. It radically changed what happened in Europe. It was never the same after that. There was a big jump, big change. And so these sorts of discoveries really change what happens in the future. And the history of Europe before the discovery of a neighboring continent was before and after was radically different. Now, under types of modernity, there's postmodernity, which there's many versions of the truth, and there's multiple conflicting authorities. This idea is that you're just going to have to deal with the ambiguity and the uncertainty of the future, and there'll be multiple threads going through. This turns out to be not a very useful argument for looking at the future for environmental science, and instead it's a much better way to analyze sort of current problems by saying, well, there's really no authority. So this is a good philosophical basis for arguing about what the causes were, but really doesn't get us into the future. And even less useful, this idea of a second modernity, where the future is uncertain and it'll be different in ways we can't even predict. That's a very hard sell to go out and talk to people that don't think about uncertainty in an academic manner. Try to say, well, it's going to be very different. So, you know, how do they think about that? So you can't really use that to bring the future into the discussion when you say, well, the future is going to be so different. And then what I've coined is this idea of retro-modernity, and I just coined this partly because the word is ambiguous in itself and inconsistent, which indicates that's what the future is going to be. But the idea is that only versions of the future that contain recognizable components of the present, those are the only ones that are actually going to be feasible future trajectories, just because, first of all, we have a slow turnover of physical assets like roads and homes and lakefronts. The other thing is people really only embrace what's familiar, especially when they're under stress. So if you go into the future thinking, well, here is an example, here's a scenario of the future that you might consider, they're familiar with what you're talking about, and it's just in a redistribution. So for example, the difference between the hierarchist view here and the individualistic view are just sort of a degree. There's different ratios of economic activity, farming activity, natural activity. It's not anything that's really radically different between those two. So you can really focus the difference on what are the choices you want to make now to move into the future. So those are some ideas about how to incorporate values into the discussion of environmental problems and predicting those into the future.